Hello everyone, this is Ali. Welcome to another video. In this video, I'm going to be talking about configuration in ASP.NET Core. With .NET Core, a configuration builder has been introduced and we've been using it implicitly or explicitly almost everywhere. And we are also able to create our custom builder, configuration builder, and add the other configurations on top of that. So in ASP.NET Core Web Application, for example, it is coming auto-implemented, pre-implemented already. You can still customize it, which is what we will be doing today. But also you can create like something like that, let's say new configuration builder, and you can add on top of that whatever you like, and then you can build it. So the value you will be getting is IConfiguration root or directly IConfiguration, and then you can use your configurations. In that configuration, it is a huge topic, to be honest. There's too many stuff that you can do with that IConfiguration or whatever comes with IConfiguration. There will be many, but also you are able to customize it. So in that case, for example, in my application, I have app settings JSON and app settings development JSON or something. In that case, for example, configuration has an extension function called add JSON file. And now I am pointing where the file is. And also I am telling if it is optional or not. And also this is important, reload on change. I'm saying this is important, but I will be getting into details later. And also this one too. So if you have like ini file, for example, if you have ini file, you can add that one as a configuration source. It's because configuration needs a source where it is going to read that data. But also that source needs to provide the provider, configuration provider. That provider should have set function as well. I'm just going to show you an example in a minute. But you can use instream, you can use in-memory collection as a configuration source. You can use keeper file, you can add user secrets, you can use XML files instead of JSON, for example. You can use XML stream, and we have something else. No, that's all. And with that function, for example, you can add your own configuration source as it accepts configuration source. I will be showing you a couple of configuration source, how you can use it. What about to be careful, actually, I'm just going to point out. But in that case, once I add that JSON file, now it knows how to read that JSON file. For example, in our JSON file, this is the key value, right? So the key should be on the left-hand side, followed by comma, semicolon. And then the value should be on the right-hand side. It can be double, it can be string value, it can be an integer, it can be anything else. But this is the pattern. So it knows when it needs to read that data from here, it knows that it is going to read the key first and then the value. But the value part might be a complex part, something like that. So the logging, if you want to read the value for the logging, you're going to need to read this first. And then there's a nested value over here. There's a nested property over here called log level. Then it has another nested value where parameter default, and then its value is information, and also has another one, something like that. So it knows how to read that data. It doesn't have to be upsetting JSON. So you can create your own custom provider or your own custom source and let the system know how to read that data from file or anywhere else. It doesn't have to be a file, but I'm just going to give you an example. You can tell it how to read the data from the file. Maybe you have your own custom format in your data file. Maybe you are reading the data from somewhere else. Maybe the data that you have in the file is encrypted and you need to decrypt it first. Maybe you have your own algorithm to decrypt for encryption and description, maybe. So you can let it know how to read that data, how to set that data, how to reload data on change. If you remember, reload on change. When anything changes, how does IConfiguration know what data changed? So I will be showing you an example over that. So let's say you have iConfiguration over here. You can read data like old value configuration, let's say config key. This is how we read the data from there. It doesn't have to be within that way. It can also be get value, for example, string, and config key. You can pass it a default value. If that key is not presented in your configuration, it will be returning that value. And we can add multiple sources to that configuration, or that configuration have multiple sources, config sources or config providers it can have. And it also has a priority. Whichever comes first, whichever has the priority, it will override the value if you have the same key in more than one place. Let's say you are adding that JSON file, but also I will be adding that JSON file as well. So development, right? So the development file will have the priority over here. Let's say that config key is presented in that one and in that one too. So if that file does exist, that value will be coming from that one. It's because now this is going to have the priority. There is a list of priorities over there. Maybe you are using, I don't know, add environment variables. In environment variables, you can have the same config, and then whichever config data you have in variable will be overriding whatever you have over there. Maybe you are also a command line. You're reading the configurations from command line. Now this is going to be overriding it, like args. Now this will be overriding the others. So I'm not going to get into details, but what I'm trying to say that you can have multiple configuration providers, and that means you can read it from one place, but also when you try to set the value to it, basically you are able to set the value as well. Now you might ask that if you have the config key in application JSON file, for example, and when you set that data, is it going to change the content of the file, or is it gonna stay the same? We will be seeing this, but this is what you can do. So not only we are reading the data, but also we are setting the data. So what I will show you is a basic configuration. Let's say, so we have already, let's say, an in-memory collection. Now you can pass a collection over here. You can say, okay, I have these configuration. This is the configuration. This is the value for it. For example, you can create a dictionary over here as it accepts enumerable key value pair. You can add those, but imagine we don't have that one and we try to add something like that, something similar. So I'm going to come over here and say custom in memory config source. I have another source over there. Oops, sources. I have another two other sources over there. I'll be showing this later, but let's start with that one. So what we are going to do is that we are going to add that in-memory config source in our application. So I'm just going to come over here and say add. So now I am setting this new config source. Now it is complaining because it says it is not a configuration source. Actually, I don't know what it is. So to be able to mark that, I need to use that interface over here, IConfigurationSource, and I need to implement that build function over here. Now it's gonna say, wait, config source, let me see. Cannot convert custom in-memory configuration to custom in-memory config source. Action, it's gonna be action. So let me get it in that way. So I'm gonna return that one. Actually, this is not gonna be that one. It is going to give me that option, and I will be having that option here. Okay. So now I'm able to create that config source, but it says you need to return IConfigurationProvider. So it doesn't know where to read the data and how to read the data. That's why I'm going to create public class custom in-memory config provider. And also the interface I'm going to use is IConfigurationProvider. So let me implement this interface and see what it returns, what it has. So it has a get child keys function that it passes you some earlier keys you can and return the additional one, so you can use the parent path. So these are basically to be able to have these nested data over here. So parent key and then the rest of that, and then the value, parameter name, and then the value. So you can add those keys only. For example, it returns keys only, not the values. It also has get reload token. So this is required when any data in your configuration changes. It needs to know, and it needs to inform the others, whoever wants to know when the data change. And to be able to do that, it uses change token. So I will be showing you an example as well. And also it has load data. This is where the magic happens actually. How you read your data? Where do you keep your, maybe you have a file. This is where you read the file content, for example. You need to load the data first, right? And then someone will able to get the data, but not get only, they will also be setting these. So this is actually what I showed you over here. So this is the getting the data. It is trying to get the data, and this is where you set it. So this is the set function. So when something happens, you need to be able to change the data as well. So in your configuration, so whenever I read it later, for example, I read the same data here now, var all let's say old value, and I'm reading it again and again. So after that point, it needs to return the new value now. So you can set the value, but when they read, you need to return that one as well. So as this is in memory, right? So as it is in memory, for example, we can use private read-only dictionary, right? So it could be my data. So whenever I don't need to do anything over here, to be honest. But when they, let's say, set the data, I will say, okay, key and value. So now I'm setting the data. And when I need to read the data, I can return try get value, right? So I'm just trying to get the data from my dictionary. When load, I don't need to do anything. Maybe I can just do this one when it is loaded, but I don't want to do that. Let's say we can just say return null change token dot singleton. It doesn't have to be written that way now. And here I can return data dot keys only, for example. Now I'm returning the keys in my data over here. So now I can return that one, for instance, new custom provider. Now everything is in the track right now. So I have my config sources. I now have my config provider, and I was able to add this one as config provider. So now it is able to read that data as well, or set the data. So this is one way you can add your custom own sources, but it doesn't have to be that simple always. It's because, for example, for that one, imagine it reads the data from the configuration and from the command line. For that one, it might be easier. It's because it is probably using the same stuff that we just had by using the dictionary. But this also needs to access the operating system's APIs and needs to read the data from environment variables. These are even more complicated. It's because the JSON could be having nested properties, lists, array, different stuff. So it needs to do its magic, right? So it might be a bit complicated. So whatever we have here is too simple, just one data as it is in memory. But you might have to do the other stuff as well. So I'm just going to show you something else over here. Something like, I'm just going to debug this. So it's because I want to show you something. So this can go, I can have it, it doesn't matter. Okay, actually I don't need that too. So I'm just going to show you something. So I will be debugging this, and in my HTTP I will hit that endpoint. So what I will show you, when I hold the mouse to configuration, what is the configuration? Let me see what is wrong. I believe this is breaking something. I'm just going to get, actually, I don't need those as it is auto-implemented. Now I will be hitting that endpoint again, send request. So when I hover the mouse and in configuration, I have 105 configuration and or sections. I will find my own, so the config key over here. As you see, the config key is here and says the value is old value and the provider is JSON configuration provider. It is auto implemented already. I didn't have to call that line. It is automatically called. So if you see config key, and let me find it again, where it is config key. And so the configuration provider is that provider. If I just get into it, it is still JSON source. So I am basically getting the value from that JSON. And as you can see, this is the old value. But when I try to set the value, as it is not going to be able to change the content of the file, let's see what's going to happen. So what's going to happen is that I will still be able to find that config key, but this time the provider has changed. Let me expand that one. The provider has changed to change the configuration provider. So this is another configuration. And if I get into that one, I will be seeing memory configuration provider for memory configuration provider. So as it is not able to read the data, change the data in your file, it is copying that key to memory configuration provider and it is reading it. So you might just want to do some sort of stuff to make sure everything happens correctly. So what I will show you is that, so in memory config source, so you might say, okay, when I pass the data over here, for example, for this ones, I also pass additional options like optional or reload on change. What does this do actually? When the file is optional, when the parameter is true, the optional parameter is true, it looks that file. If it is not there, it is not doing anything, as it says, okay, this was optional, so I couldn't find, there's no harm on that. But if it was false, for example, and if the file is not presented over there, it was going to throw an exception. So this is another option for that one. For this one, if you set this true, now it is watching that file. If anything happens, that file might be deleted, that file might be recreated, that file might be changed, so updated. So it is not reading those to be able to let the others know about this one. So these are the optional options. So we might be able to do the same stuff over here. For example, this, let's say your provider, I don't know if your provider needs some parameters, right? So for example, as if it is optional or not. So this might be one of your parameters, or reload on change. So your config source might need some other stuff. Let's say we have public class custom in memory config source options. This might be your class, and so let's say the value key, whatever parameter you need, you can ask them. For example, we can say boolean optional, right? It doesn't make sense for in memory, but this is something that you might have. Optional, maybe it is optional. So now you can ask user to pass that one. So if we get into that one, for example, if I come here and say, so it says pass me a configuration source. I don't have to be using it within that way. So what I can do is I can use that one too. So for example, if I ask that option in here, let's say options in primary constructor, I should be able to pass that configuration provider from here by saying optional true. This is the same stuff actually. Instead of creating that one, I could have created an extension function, accepts those and does the same thing. So I'm basically doing the same stuff over here. So what else we can do? So for example, as this is file, I would have to make some changes. If it is optional, for example, and check if the file is there or something like that. But you might say, if this is file, so file-based stuff, and most of the file-based stuff has the same sort of parameters, like if the file is already over there, if file is being used by another process or something. In C#, we have different sort of sources. For example, what I will show you is custom file config source. So .NET Core comes with file config source. So instead of implementing your own, where is it? So instead of IConfigurationSource, you can use file configuration source. And if we get into that one, you will see it has the file provider, it has the related other parameters, and it also resolve file providers by saying if it is a physical file, if it is virtual file, if it is I don't know, if the file is already over there, the other stuff. So as you can see, physical file provider it uses, but also and it has ensure default, so it sets the default as well, get file provider, for example. But the build one is abstract, so you need to be able to override that one. Also, it has exceptions, onload, if there's something wrong, you can use that one, and also this one too. So this is for pre-implemented. So the file path you can pass, for example, while adding this config source as a custom source, now you can ask user to provide the file path, as we are already doing it over here. For example, it is the same stuff, right? So you can ask for the file path. You can set the file path within that config source, and then set the optional. Maybe you can have the optional parameter as well, and set this one over here. And reload on change, this is the same stuff except the third parameter, and reload on change. And then you need to call that file provider, so it would know where the file is, and if it is physical file, it's gonna create a physical file provider or something like that. So these are the simple way to have the file config sources. And in terms of the provider, we also have file configuration provider, which requires that source again, and we need to override that load function. And this is where the magic happens. This is where you read the data. So it gives you everything actually. So you pass the file path, if it is optional or not, and you have the file provider too, and it gives the content to you as stream. So you can read that stream, you can have the content, and the rest is basically parse the data. For example, if it is JSON, you can use JSON deserializer, you can use JSON object, JSON documents, or whatever. It really doesn't matter. So you have the data over here. So this is how the file config source and provider works behind the scene. You can implement it from scratch, or you can use the pre-implemented ones, but it doesn't have to be file always. For example, if you are using Azure has a configuration platform, configuration provider, Azure configuration provider. So you can have your configuration somewhere in Azure, and you can add that one as a custom provider, custom source. So your application will be able to read the data from Azure. But remember, in ASP.NET Core, the configuration part happens before your service injections. So it's because you're adding your configuration, and it builds that, and then you add your services to dependency injection. But everything happens before build, which means in the configuration phase, you are not able to use the dependency injection. Let's say you've added some services here. Not there. So for example, Open API. So this is added already. So in configuration, for example, in your config source, you're not going to be able to use any service that you've added over here. For example, you cannot consume any Open API services in that one. It's because this needs to happen before this is being built. So you're adding your services and you're building it. After you're building it, it basically builds all the services and it gives you the service provider, service provider. Then you will be able to use that service provider to ask for any services that's been injected earlier. But in the configuration source, it is not possible. I'll go back to cloud side. So for example, when you add the Azure configuration provider, you cannot use any implemented services or any service that you will be implementing in that one. That's why it's gonna require all the parameters it needs from the user. For example, if it needs to read the data from a specific URL with some sort of specific credential, it is going to ask you for it. So let me show you something over here. I have custom service config source. Let's say you are reading your configurations from somewhere else, a third-party services. As this is going to happen before the service injection, you're not going to be able to use any services, right? That's why you need to create your own HTTP client. You need to ask user to provide the service URL. For example, this is the option that I require, for instance. So service URL and API key. It doesn't have to be API key. It can even be some sort of credential that the user needs to pass. But this is the let me show you. This is the source, and I'm returning that provider. This is super simple. I just required that option, and I'm passing that option to provider, so provider can use HTTP client and URL, the other URL. But this is actually where you customize stuff. So you have the base URL and child key as we did earlier. And again, reload change token. So what's going to happen when anything changes on the Azure side, on the service side? How often do you need to load that one, for example? So this is where you use the HTTP client and load everything from the server. And this is the set function. As you know, we can now set, but for that one, for example, you probably are not going to be able to set the configuration on Azure, but you can still do that. It doesn't matter. And this is how you get the data. So you can, if you're going to use some service-based, third-party call-based configuration option, you need to remember that you're not going to be able to use any other services. You need to create your own services inside and be able to use that. There's a way around, but it is don't even ask me how I know. That's because I had to implement that. But this is basically what you can do, not all. So this is just a slight part, small part of what you can do with that IConfiguration. But if you want to build your own config source and provider, this is what you can do. So there are a few, let's say, so I said there is file configuration source over there. If you go into that one, you can see this is an extension in that namespace. For example, you can get into that one and search for source. You will be able to find the others too, other predefined, for example, changed configuration source, stream configuration source, and file configuration source. Those are pre-implemented ones. And you also have providers for those: file configuration provider, stream configuration provider, configuration provider, and chained configuration provider. This is how we can do that. It is a super massive topic. You can do many stuff. You can't do some sort of stuff. But if you want to learn about this stuff more, please let me know in the comment section below. And if you like the video, please hit the like button. If you don't want to miss the next videos, the feature videos, please subscribe the channel and hit the notification bell so you will be notified. Until the next video, happy coding.